the music world stood still, gripped by grief and disbelief. On July 22, 2025, Ozzy Osbourne, at the age of 76, said his final goodbye. The so-called Prince of Darkness passed away after a long and painful battle with Parkinson's disease and a relentless string of health issues that haunted his final years. One of his most haunting confessions now echoes like a prophecy fulfilled. The last 4 years have been a living hell. My health has been in a terrible state. He was more than a rock legend. He was a man who stared into the abyss again and again and kept walking. A man whose every breath became an act of defiance against the constant pain. Parkinson's disease didn't just weaken him. It robbed him of the strength in his legs. A brutal fall shattered his spine, plunging him into a cycle of surgeries and a silence deeper than ever before. And now, as the world mourns him, it's clear fate delivered its final and most merciless blow. Behind the shadow of the Prince of Darkness was a weary soul longing for rest, a warrior worn down by an endless war. What happened to Ozzy wasn't just another tragic tale, it was a revelation, harsh and heartbreaking, that leaves a mark long after the music stops. Before we continue, consider clicking like as a quiet tribute to a man who gave everything and now leaves behind a silence louder than any scream. Before the roaring crowds, before the blinding lights, before his name was etched into music history, there was only silence. A silence so heavy it threatened to crush the soul of a boy who didn't grow up dreaming. He grew up surviving. In the working-class neighborhood of Aston, Birmingham, a boy named John Michael Osbourne, born in 1948, lived in a cold, cramped home with 6 siblings and 2 exhausted parents who had no strength left for affection. His father, worn down by factory work, believed showing emotion was a sign of weakness. His mother, hardened by long shifts on an assembly line, barely had energy left for tenderness. Ozzy, as the world would later know him, wasn't seen as smart or charming. He was the overlooked one, the boy fading into the background of poverty. School didn't offer any refuge. Letters confused him, numbers mocked him. In the 1950s, dyslexia wasn't understood. It was mistaken for stupidity. Teachers gave up on him. Classmates bullied him cruelly. And the torment didn't stop at words. It was fists in the hallway, knees to the stomach, busted lips behind the school building. And no adult ever asked what was happening. There was no comfort at home either. One day, he came home crying. His father beat him with a belt, not for being in pain, but for showing it. In that household, weakness was never tolerated. Pain didn't earn compassion, Ozzy would later recall. It only brought punishment. And so, the silence around him grew. He learned to wear it like armor. But armor doesn't heal. By the time he turned 14, in 1962, the silence had become unbearable. In his dimly lit bedroom, he tied a rope from his mother's clothesline, stood on a chair, and waited for the world to let him go. Fate intervened, not with mercy, but with force. His father burst in and yanked him down, then beat him again, as if violence could scare the despair away. That day, something inside him broke. Or maybe it hardened for good. He stopped trying. He stopped speaking, unless he absolutely had to. He became a withdrawn teenager, carrying the gaze of someone already saying goodbye to life. Laughter felt foreign. The mirror reflected someone who was fading. At 15, he dropped out of school. He had no diploma, no direction, no plan. He took whatever jobs he could find, in a slaughterhouse, on construction sites, in factories tuning car horns, but he was too distracted, too clumsy, too wounded to last anywhere for long. Each job ended the same, fired, forgotten, alone. By 17, hunger was no longer a metaphor, it was real. His shoes had holes, his shirts hung in shreds. Hope was a crumpled piece of paper he no longer bothered to hold on to. He was running out of air, not just in his lungs, but in his life. And when desperation arrived, it didn't whisper. It screamed. In 1965, a failed attempt to rob a clothing store landed him in Winston Green Prison. Behind those cold walls, reality hit like steel. One terrifying incident involved another inmate attacking him. Ozzy defended himself with the only thing nearby, a metal bedpan. It wasn't bravery, it was survival. But even in that darkness, a spark refused to die. One afternoon, through the prison radio, he heard "She Loves You" by the Beatles, and something lit up inside him. For the first time, Ozzy didn't want to disappear. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be heard. He wanted to live loud. "That moment changed me," he later said. "I didn't know how to play an instrument, but I knew I had to be on a stage. I had to scream louder than the pain inside me. That scream became his salvation. Not success, not yet, but a reason to keep going. In that cell, the same boy who once begged the world to let him go made a quiet promise. He would not die forgotten in Birmingham. He would be loud. He would be terrifying. He would be unforgettable. And from that vow, a legend began to take shape. Not out of peace or privilege, but from the ashes of despair, where pain forged a voice powerful enough to shake the world. The shadows of his youth had barely started to fade when something extraordinary pierced the silence, a sound, a calling that would anchor his soul for decades. Fresh out of prison in 1965 at just 17 years old, Ozzy wasn't looking for redemption. He simply wandered through a world that had already discarded him. His 6-week sentence for a desperate robbery hadn't taught him any lessons. It only confirmed how little he mattered to others. He left that cell more broken than he'd ever been. And then came the miracle. Not in the form of a savior, but in the form of a song. That same Beatles tune he'd heard in prison. He heard it again, and it felt like the universe cracked open. It was like hearing God speak to me through music, he once recalled, his voice trembling. That moment didn't erase the bruises on his back or the fear in his bones, but it gave him a vision. He didn't know how, but he had to make music. Not perfect music, music that screamed louder than the silence of his childhood, louder than the darkness that had nearly swallowed him whole. By 1968, that scream had found an echo. A simple newspaper ad looking for a singer led him to a dusty rehearsal room in Birmingham. There he met 3 men who were just as haunted. Tony Iommi, a guitarist with severed fingertips and a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Geezer Butler, a bassist obsessed with the occult whose lyrics gave the band a chilling mystique. And Bill Ward, a drummer who played like thunder, had learned to breathe. At first, they called themselves Earth. But one day, after walking past a movie theater marquee that read Black Sabbath, something shifted. If people pay to be scared, Ozzy later said, why not give them music that terrifies and thrills them? They weren't chasing fame. They were chasing survival, trying to purge something dark, something no one dared to say out loud. Their songs weren't just entertainment. They were exorcisms. They were pain turned into distortion, grief transformed into guitar riffs. On Friday the 13th of February 1970, they released their first album. The title, Mau Black Sabbath. The date, nearly cursed, seemed chosen by fate. Critics hated it. They were labeled satanic, repulsive, unlistenable. But the youth, the broken, the outcasts, they listened. And for the first time, they felt seen. In a world that never asked how they felt, Ozzy screamed it for them. That same year, their second album, Paranoid, was written in a rush, almost by accident, and it became gospel. Songs like War Pigs, Iron Man, and Paranoid weren't just hits, they were lifelines. Ozzy's voice wasn't trained. It wasn't even tuned, but it was real. It was raw. It was the voice of a man who had crawled back from the edge, daring the world to push him again. I didn't know what I was doing, he admitted, But I knew I had to be strong. I had to be loud. And that noise wasn't just sound. It was vengeance. It was a scream that said, I survived, and I won't be silent. He never learned to read music. He never took formal lessons, but he didn't need to, because his pain was the melody. His scars were the lyrics. His past was the rhythm, and his soul, the amplifier. Behind the wild persona, behind the theatrics, and the madness on stage, still lived that boy from Aston, the one they called stupid, worthless, invisible. That boy was still screaming. But now the world was listening. The early years of Black Sabbath weren't just about inventing a genre. They were about reclaiming a life. Ozzy didn't invent heavy metal. He bled it into existence. Every concert, every growl, every riff was rebellion against the fate he was expected to accept. And though fame arrived like a tidal wave, stadiums packed, albums selling by the millions, magazines plastered with his image, he was still tormented. The louder the applause, the louder the voices in his head screamed back. Success never silenced the pain. It only masked it. And as the world began to call him a legend, Ozzy still felt like a fugitive, shouting into a void, but that scream, it changed the world. He didn't just make music. He created myth. He built memory. He forged a legacy out of torment and a force no one could quite explain. By the mid-1970s, Ozzy Osbourne stood at the pinnacle of heavy metal. But beneath the blinding stage lights and the endless applause, his soul was quietly unraveling. The same voice that had once pierced a generation's silence was now smothered by inner demons no spotlight could reach. Black Sabbath had become a global phenomenon. Pioneers of a thunderous sound that spoke directly to the rejected, the wounded, the furious. But for Ozzy, the louder the music grew, the more deafening his loneliness became. Behind closed doors, he was falling apart, consumed by self-destruction, haunted by childhood wounds that never healed, numb under the crushing weight of fame. Album after album, like Wig Paranoid in 1970 and Sabbath Bloody Sabbath in 1973, elevated the band to iconic status. But Ozzy faded into the shadows even the stage lights couldn't chase away. His bandmates began noticing his growing absences during rehearsals, his incoherent ramblings, the spark behind those wild eyes flickering out. Tony Iommi, his partner in riffs, began to grow distant. The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken resentments. And then, in 1979, came the final betrayal. They fired him, not to his face, not with dignity. They sent someone else to deliver the news. I wish they'd had the guts to tell me themselves, Ozzy later said, his voice heavy with sorrow. That was my band. It wasn't just a career cut short. It was his sanctuary, his safe place, torn away from him. Black Sabbath wasn't just music to Ozzy. It was the only space where his chaos made sense, where his broken pieces became power. And without it, he was exiled, discarded like a cautionary tale. He locked himself away in a hotel room in Los Angeles, with the curtains drawn tight. His soul was drowning. I'd sit there, he later remembered, numbing myself until I felt nothing. I thought I'd dissolve into that silence. To the outside world, he was still Ozzy Osbourne. But in that room, he was just an echo. A ghost with a heartbeat, a scream trapped inside the man who once taught the world how to scream. But legends don't vanish. They evolve. And in Ozzy's darkest hour, something stirred within the ashes. Sharon Arden, the daughter of Black Sabbath's former manager, didn't see a fallen idol. She saw a man who wasn't finished yet. She pulled him from the wreckage and whispered the unthinkable. You were the magic in that band. You can do this without them. That belief struck like lightning on wet stone. Then came Randy Rhoads, young, focused, unrealistically talented. His guitar didn't just play. It wept, soared, screamed. To Ozzy, Randy was more than a bandmate. He was a lifeline. Together, they created Blizzard of Oz, released in 1980, an album born not from celebration, but from sheer survival. Tracks like Crazy Train weren't just rock anthems, they were declarations of life. Each verse, each riff, shouted, "I'm still here, I still matter." In time, Ozzy would reflect. The breakdown wasn't the end, it was the crucible. He had to be shattered completely to discover the fire burning inside him. And though the road ahead would be filled with loss, grief, and battles deeper than fame ever reached, that was the moment when his spirit roared the loudest. The bond between Ozzy Osbourne and Randy Rhoads went beyond music. It was spiritual, emotional, almost otherworldly. Randy didn't just show up with a guitar. He arrived like a beam of light through a storm. For Ozzy, still staggering from the humiliation of being cast out of Black Sabbath, clinging to sanity by frayed threads, Randy was living proof that there was still beauty, still order, still meaning in a world that had turned cruel. Randy's youth wasn't chaotic, it was focused. His creativity didn't explode, it flowed like fire in a glass jar. It's intense but deliberate. They weren't just making music, they were building a form of salvation through sound. When they released Diary of a Madman in 1981, it wasn't just a second album, it was a statement. Ozzy, dismissed as a burnout, stood tall again, reborn through fire, and Randy helped forge that path. People called him a guitarist, Ozzy once said. To me, he was my friend, my little brother, and the only reason I didn't give up. Their connection went deeper than melody. It was the heartbeat keeping Ozzy's fragile rebirth alive. On stage, they were electric. Ozzy, raw and wild. Randy, graceful and unearthly. Offstage, they shared laughter, late-night talks, deep respect. Ozzy admired him not just for his talent, but for his spirit. There was something special about him, Ozzy would recall. Like he knew he didn't have much time, so every note counted. There was a silent urgency in their collaboration, a shared understanding that miracles don't last forever. And when they do happen, they must be honored, but storms don't stay quiet. And deep down, Ozzy felt it. That uneasy calm before fate strikes again. They were flying too high, and that could never last. When it broke, it wouldn't be gradual, it would be catastrophic. On March 19th, 1982, the nightmare Ozzy never saw coming finally arrived, silently, like a scream stuck in the throat. During a tour stop in Leesburg, Florida, the band's bus pulled into a private property owned by the driver. There, parked quietly, was a small private plane, a temptation on a restless morning. The driver, a licensed pilot, decided to take it for a quick flight. Randy Rhoads, ever curious and calm, boarded with makeup artist Rachel Youngblood. Just a short ride in the sky, a loop before hitting the road again. Ozzy watched from below. He smiled faintly. Maybe, somehow, he already sensed the shadow he couldn't name. The plane made 2 passes, but on the third, the unthinkable happened. One of the wings clipped the band's tour bus. In an instant, the aircraft spun out of control, plunged downward, and exploded in flames. Randy Rhoads was only 25, a shooting star extinguished in broad daylight. Ozzy ran toward the wreckage, screaming Randy's name until his voice gave out. The flames weren't just fire, they were the end. He collapsed beside the wreck, trembling, sobbing, unable to process what he was seeing. For hours he was inconsolable. For days he said nothing. For weeks he wandered through a fog of disbelief. That day I lost a piece of myself, he later confessed. It wasn't just Randy's body left in those flames. It was my hope, my music, my reason for breathing. The man who had been saved by a friend was now dragged back into darkness by fate. And this time, the fall felt endless. Even Sharon couldn't reach him at first. The concerts were canceled. The laughter disappeared. The house fell silent, as if the universe itself had muted the melody. Randy's death didn't just break Ozzy, it emptied him out. And though time forced him to keep moving forward, a part of his soul remained in those flames on that cruel March morning. Ozzy had watched in horror as that small plane exploded before his eyes. And in that moment, something inside him went dark. For weeks, he vanished into silence. He wouldn't speak, he wouldn't eat. He drowned himself in alcohol, trying to numb the unbearable loss. Losing Randy was like losing part of my soul. He would say years later, I didn't want to live, I didn't want to make music, I didn't want anything. This wasn't just grief, it was emotional paralysis. Sharon, who had once anchored him to life, couldn't reach through the fog this time. I thought I had lost him forever, she later admitted, her voice cracking with sorrow. But from the deepest part of that despair, something unexplainable began to stir. Ozzy started to write again, not to forget, but to remember. Each lyric, each scream into a microphone, became a tribute to the friend he would never stop mourning. The pain didn't fade, but Ozzy understood that the music had to continue, not for the fans, not even for himself, but for Randy. His survival became an act of defiance, and every concert that followed carried the weight of a legacy built from tragedy. He wasn't healed, but he was in motion. And for Ozzy Osbourne, that meant he was still alive. You might think the worst was behind him, that surviving the unimaginable would finally teach the soul how to heal. But grief does not follow rules. And for Ozzy, the years after Randy's death weren't about recovery. They were about descent. A slow, silent, devastating descent. The 1980s rolled by like a storm. Every tour felt like a war zone. Every hotel room, a shattered mirror where he no longer recognized himself. On stage, the world saw a wild man with smudged eyeliner, a living legend cloaked in chaos. But behind the curtain, Ozzy was falling apart. Volatile, untouchable, barely standing. Sharon, his anchor, did everything she could. She had saved him once, and she refused to let go. But even her love couldn't always cut through the fog he carried inside. I wasn't even in my own life, Ozzy would later say in a fragile whisper. I was gone. By 1987, alcohol had consumed him entirely. Pills kept him in a haze, somewhere between memory and escape. Between consciousness and oblivion. Then came August 1989, a night not born from rage, but from complete collapse. A night when Ozzy, lost deep within himself, did something so devastating it shook the very foundations of everything he held dear. In a fog he would barely remember, he nearly destroyed the one person who had given him everything, Sharon. That wasn't me, he would later confess. It was like I was watching someone else do it. And when I woke up and realized what had happened, I broke. I didn't want to exist anymore. That night, he was arrested. Confused. Empty. Unable to grasp the full weight of what had happened. Sharon, with more heartbreak than anger, would later say, I didn't know whether to press charges or beg for help. All I knew was that something had to change for both of us. So Ozzy wasn't just sent to rehab. He was placed somewhere where he would finally confront the wreckage of the man he had become. The man his children no longer recognized. The man he could no longer find in the mirror. No costumes, no guitars, just silence. A counselor once asked him, "What are you most afraid of?" Without hesitation, Ozzy replied, "That she'll leave. That this time I've pushed her too far." But Sharon didn't leave. She walked into that room, her eyes tired but still burning bright, and she said, "You're still in there, I know it." It wasn't forgiveness, it was a declaration of war. Every day in that recovery center was a battle, not for fame, not even for redemption, but for the right to keep the love he had almost destroyed. The fight was brutal. Ozzy didn't walk out cured. He walked out changed, thinner, quieter, marked by what he had seen inside himself, but for the first time, aware of how far he had fallen and how precious it would be to rise again. Years later, he would put it simply, "That was when I realized I couldn't keep falling and pretend I was flying. I had to choose to live." And after the storm, there wasn't peace, but a heavy silence. Not the calm kind, the hollow kind. Ozzy Osbourne, stripped of arrogance, without a stage, without masks, stood on the edge of the life he had nearly destroyed, unsure if anything remained of the man he used to be. In 1989, after that night when he nearly became the darkest version of himself, when the woman who had once saved him became the victim of his own collapse, Ozzy Osbourne was arrested, but he wasn't sent to prison. He was committed to a psychiatric institution. It wasn't a punishment, it was his last chance. Inside those walls, there was no music, no lights, no crowds, only a man drowning in guilt, soaked in shame, spending weeks without saying a single word. The iconic voice of heavy metal was reduced to a whisper, barely audible in the hushed halls of recovery. But outside, Sharon waited. She came back, not out of obligation, out of defiance. She saw what no one else could see, the flicker still burning beneath the ruins. There was still a light in him, she later said, buried deep, but it was there. And in those sterile corridors, Ozzy began to fight. Not against an audience, not against critics, but against the monsters that lived inside his chest. The detox process hit him like fire. It didn't just burn out the toxins, it burned away illusions. It forced him to face every memory, every mistake, every scar. It wasn't healing, it was war. But step by step, with trembling hands and raw conviction, he moved forward. He wasn't healed, he was awake. And in 1990, he did the unthinkable. He returned to music, not with the fury of youth, but with something even stronger: clarity. He reunited with guitarist Zakk Wylde, and together they began crafting what would become No More Tears, an album born not from chaos, but from survival. Released in 1991, it wasn't just a comeback, it was a reckoning. Tracks like Mama, I'm Coming Home, and Road to Nowhere weren't just radio hits. They were confessions carved into the bones of a broken man trying to put himself back together. It was the sound of me trying to be human again, he would later say, his voice soft but steady. The world listened. Fans who feared his silence was permanent watched him rise again. Not as a myth, but as a man. Off stage, the struggle continued. Every show was a victory, every sober sunrise a miracle. Sharon remained by his side. No longer just his savior, she was now his fellow soldier, fighting with him, not for him. I owe her everything, Ozzy admitted. She didn't save me once. She saves me every single day. Their marriage, once teetering on the edge, became a testament to endurance. Imperfect, but unbreakable. In the early 1990s, Ozzy threw himself into work like he was afraid to stop. Endless tours, more albums, and in 1992, he even announced a farewell tour. But true to form, he kept coming back. Because even though he had survived, the pain never truly left. It chased him through the silence. It seeped into his lyrics. It lingered in his stare, and the audience felt it. Because when Ozzy stepped onto a stage and howled into the dark, it wasn't for show. It was a way to keep breathing. Years later, reflecting on those times, he would say, I never thought I'd live this long. Every day is borrowed time. I'm just trying to make it count. For those who understood the full weight of what he'd endured, the prisons, the losses, the madness, and the mercy, his return wasn't just a comeback, it was a resurrection. The Prince of Darkness had looked into the abyss, and instead of giving in, he climbed out, bruised, bleeding, but breathing. And though the wounds never fully healed, he carried them as proof. Proof that survival isn't about luck. It's a choice made at rock bottom and reaffirmed every day after. Just when the storm seemed to quiet, when Ozzy Osbourne had finally found a fragile balance, built on fractured memories and hard-won redemption, fate struck again. But this time, it wasn't scandal. It wasn't relapse. It was something more brutal. His body, after everything it had endured, finally demanded the bill. The early 2000s should have been his golden era, a time for reflection, a time to rest. His music was being rediscovered by a younger generation, and the Osbournes, a raw, unscripted glimpse into his family life, turned him into an unexpected cultural icon. He was no longer just the Prince of Darkness. Now, he was a bewildered, lovable dad arguing with the remote control and wandering through the kitchen in mismatched pajamas. The show premiered in 2002 and became a phenomenon. Ozzy entered homes that had never heard a single Black Sabbath riff. But behind that surreal domestic fame was a man still walking a tightrope, well into his 50s. The weight of a life lived on the edge began to show. His joints stiffened. His reflexes slowed. His health grew more fragile by the day. And then, on December 8th, 2003, everything fell apart again. A casual ride on his estate's ATV ended in disaster. He lost control of the vehicle. It flipped violently, hurling him to the ground. The impact was catastrophic. He shattered his collarbone, broke several ribs, crushed a vertebra in his neck. His lungs collapsed. He stopped breathing. He was rushed to the hospital, placed on a ventilator, and remained in a coma for 8 days, silent, still, terrifyingly vulnerable. Sharon would later recall, "I thought I was going to lose him. I was preparing to say goodbye." Around the world, fans held their breath. After everything he had survived, was this the moment the curtain finally fell? But Ozzy once again defied expectations. He woke up, blinking under the harsh hospital lights, whispering words no one expected to hear again. Doctors warned that it could take months, maybe even years, for him to walk again, to regain strength, to breathe normally. But Ozzy had spent a lifetime doing the impossible, through agony that stole his breath and rehab sessions that demanded everything. He began to rebuild. Every tiny step was a triumph, every breath a reminder. And in 2004, just months later, he walked onto the stage at the Brit Awards. The ovation was thunderous, not just from fans, but from a world that had seen him fall and rise once more. Still, the accident left scars no scan could reveal. Chronic pain became a constant whisper. Some days, even moving felt like scaling a mountain. "I wake up and it hurts," he admitted, "but I'm still breathing. That's enough." It was that quiet resilience, no longer a roar, but a defiant growl, that defined Ozzy's later years. His strength didn't come from thunderous guitars anymore, or from pyrotechnics. It came from refusing to give in even when everything hurt, from daring to rise again when staying down would have been so much easier. He had turned survival into an art, and pain into poetry, and when he returned to the public eye, slower but still standing, one thing became clear. Some legends don't burn out. They outlast the fire. Just when Ozzy Osbourne thought he had endured everything life could throw at him, when it seemed the scars had finally settled into silence. 2019 came with ruthless cruelty. There were no blinding lights this time. No roaring crowds to drown out the fear. Just an ordinary day at home. And a single fateful misstep. A fall, seemingly minor, unleashed catastrophe. The metal rods that had been implanted in his spine after the 2003 ATV crash shifted within seconds. It was as if the past had returned, not with memories, but with vengeance. Tearing open old wounds, both physical and emotional, dragging him back into a kind of pain that defied explanation. Ozzy later said in an interview, his voice barely steady, "It was pain beyond anything I'd ever felt." And coming from someone whose life was built on suffering,
Those words chilled. But the fall wasn't the end. It was the beginning of another brutal chapter. Shortly afterward, doctors gave him another devastating diagnosis. Parkinson's disease. A silent, relentless enemy. Not one that strikes all at once, but one that slowly erodes everything. Movement, balance.
Freedom. For Ozzy, who had once ruled the stage with boundless energy, it felt like losing his identity. The tremors began, the loss of coordination, and eventually the public confession. No filters, no costumes. "I can't walk properly anymore," he said. "I just shuffle." There was no persona, no star power, only a man reduced to his rawest truth. His words didn't just express honesty, they carried pain. This wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. The world, who had watched him cheat death time and again, was now witnessing him face something far more personal, time itself. "These last few years have been miserable," he confessed in his later days. His voice, full of fatigue and sadness, the pain, the fear, the loss of control. There was nothing theatrical about it. It was real. Sharon remained by his side. As always, steadfast, loyal. But even her unwavering devotion couldn't stop the quiet, steady advance of a disease that was slowly transforming the man she loved. And as all of this unfolded, Ozzy was battling more than just his failing body. He was also wrestling with guilt. He had kept his condition hidden from the public for a while, not out of pride, but out of love. Love for the fans who had stood by him for decades. He didn't want to break their hearts. But when the truth finally came out, the world didn't turn away. It leaned in, closer than ever. Fans didn't see weakness. They saw extraordinary strength in a man who dared to show his pain. And still, despite the chaos in his bones, despite the tremble in his voice, Ozzy kept creating. In 2020, he released Ordinary Man, an album shaped by pain but lit with something unexpected: defiance. It wasn't just music, it was a declaration carved in sorrow and persistence. "I'm still here, I still have something to say." Ozzy Osbourne's fight was never just about the music, it was about meaning, about the right to keep going, even when every part of you is begging to stop. Each step he took, now supported by canes, with aching joints, was an act of rebellion. Every note he sang was a protest. And though there were surgeries, endless hospital stays, and moments when even he doubted whether he would rise again, he never surrendered. "I'm not ready to hang up the mic just yet," he declared. And in that single phrase, he packed everything: fire, memory, hope. That's what made his story so powerful. Not the fame, not the legacy, but the way he got back up, again and again, even when he had every reason not to. In the final stretch of his life, Ozzy Osbourne, worn down by time, but never erased by it, left the world with one last truth. Real legends do not disappear in silence. They leave echoes. And now, even though the stage lights have gone dark, that echo, raw, imperfect, deeply human, still reverberates. At 76 years old, the darkness surrounding Ozzy Osbourne no longer came from pyrotechnics or spotlights. It was something more subtle, colder, and more relentless. Time. In his final years, his battle with Parkinson's intensified. It reshaped every corner of his life. The Prince of Darkness, once untouchable, now woke to hands that trembled without warning, legs that sometimes refused to move, a voice that had once shaken stadium, now barely a fragile murmur. Each day began with uncertainty. Some mornings he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back, but even in that fragility, he held on to the fight. "There are days I don't know who I am," he admitted, "but I'm still fighting. I'm not done yet." His world had grown smaller. It wasn't about the stage anymore. It was about endurance, daily therapy sessions, Timed medications, physical support systems, constant care. That was the new rhythm of life. Sharon, the woman who had stood beside him through every collapse and every comeback, was still there. No longer just a wife, but his entire foundation. Their home in Buckinghamshire was no longer just a house, it had become a sanctuary, a place built around the new needs of the man who once roared on stage and now walked with caution. Handrails in the hallways, ramps instead of stairs. Every detail whispered adaptation, and yet, within those walls, Ozzy still searched for pieces of the man he used to be. On good days, he would sit in the garden, headphones on, listening to the riffs that built his world. Sometimes, he stepped into his home studio, not to record for the fans, but to reconnect with the soul that still lived in that music. His body grew weaker, but his mind stayed sharp. He still cracked jokes, still cursed, still surprised interviewers with flashes of dark humor and disarming honesty. When he spoke of death, it wasn't with fear. "It's just the next tour," he joked. "Only this time there's no sound check." That was Ozzy, irreverent, defiant, even in decline. Tro. But beneath the wit, there was a calm acceptance. He knew the end was near. He had canceled all his remaining concerts. The stage was part of the past. And yet, in true Ozzy fashion, he refused to let that be the final note. Instead of disappearing, he built his farewell with dignity and with heart. A quiet exit for a man whose life had been anything but quiet. His legacy, etched in pain and perseverance, would echo louder than any encore. He no longer sang, but in every breath, every memory, every lyric he left behind, he proved one final truth. Legends do not die with the music. They live in the silence they leave behind. And then, on July 5th, 2025, something happened that wasn't just another concert. It felt like a prayer, a farewell spoken aloud for an entire generation. Ozzy Osbourne, joined by the original members of Black Sabbath, returned to the city where it all began. Birmingham. They called it Back to the Beginning, but that night felt like standing on the edge of an ending. More than 40,000 fans filled the arena. Nearly 6 million more watched from around the world. When Ozzy appeared, walking slowly, leaning on a cane with Sharon by his side, the crowd fell into absolute silence. Not out of protocol, but out of reverence. It wasn't a performance, it was a goodbye. Built on tremors, both physical and emotional. His voice shook with age. His hands weren't steady. But when the first chords rang out, time seemed to dissolve. Each word was a memory, each riff a resurrection. "This is it," he whispered, and you could almost hear thousands of hearts break all at once. "This might be the last time I stand on a stage," he said later. Not with sadness, but with complete serenity. That night the curtain didn't fall with a crash. It drifted down gently, like dusk settling over a career carved in thunder. And true to his nature, Ozzy didn't just say farewell, he transcended. Every dollar earned from that concert, an astonishing $190 million, was donated to causes that had moved him most deeply. Research toward a cure for Parkinson's, the Birmingham Children's Hospital, and the Acorn Hospice for Children. It wasn't just a parting gift. It was a vow, a final promise that even in physical decline, he would still be a force for good. In the final weeks of his life, even though the spotlight no longer followed him on stage, Ozzy kept in touch with his fans, not through chaos or pyrotechnics, but through moments of quiet honesty. Through the Osbournes' podcast, he and Sharon opened the door to their private world. They replaced performance with truth. And when he wasn't near a microphone, he was in his garden, surrounded by grandchildren who curled up at his feet, telling stories about a world that once roared, stories of bats and madness, of love and redemption, of shadows and second chances. But by then, those stories weren't about chaos anymore. They were about what it takes to survive it. In the twilight of his journey, Before leaving this world on July 22, 2025, Ozzy Osbourne gave us one final lesson, the one he had lived from the very beginning. Legends are not forged in noise. They are proven in the silence that follows. And even when they fall, they rise again in the echoes they leave behind. In that quiet corner of his story, where stadium roars had faded into the garden breeze and the soft voices of his family replaced the roar of guitars, Ozzy found his legacy, not in platinum records, but in the faces that surrounded him, in the children who inherited not just his name, but pieces of his soul. Amy Osbourne, his eldest, born in 1983, chose a quieter path. She declined the spotlight of reality TV and pursued her music under her own name, proving that silence can be just as powerful as a scream. Kelly Osbourne, born in 1984, became a reflection of her father's resilience. Irreverent but elegant, outspoken yet grounded, a singer, designer, and public figure, she honored Ozzy's legacy with every step, while forging her own with strength and authenticity. Jack Osbourne, the youngest of his children with Sharon, grew from a teenager on screen into a serious documentary producer, many of his works exploring the unexplained and the supernatural. But more than his career, Jack was his father's constant companion. He accompanied him to medical appointments, helped manage his business decisions, and quietly carried part of the weight of a legacy too big for one man alone. From his first marriage to Thelma Riley came Jessica and Lewis. Both chose to stay out of the public eye, but remained part of Ozzy's universe. Though they were discreet, their family bond was never broken. The connection between Ozzy and all his children, especially Kelly and Jack, was evident in every public appearance. Whether at events, in interviews, or in those rare family photos, there was more than affection. There was something deeper, an emotional inheritance, a continuation of the struggle, and the strength it takes to endure. And as Ozzy gradually stepped away from the stage that had defined him for half a century, his children became more than his family. They became the keepers of his flame. Perhaps the most powerful chapter of Ozzy's final years wasn't about the music he left behind, but the purpose with which he chose to say goodbye. The man who once believed wealth meant freedom came to understand at the end that a true legacy lies in what you choose to do with it. With a net worth of over $220 million in 2025, Ozzy finalized his will, not out of fear of the end, but out of respect for a life he had miraculously survived. Sharon and their 5 children would inherit his estate, with clear trusts in place for his grandchildren's health and education. But what truly set his will apart was what extended beyond the family tree. A significant portion of his fortune was dedicated to the very causes that saved him when no one else could. Mental health initiatives for musicians, addiction recovery programs, scholarships for working-class youth who dream in chords and distortion, and lifelong funding for animal shelters. Because even in the midst of chaos, Ozzy had always loved the quiet loyalty of dogs. They brought me back to myself, he once wrote in a private note, now attached to his will. So I owe them whatever is left of me. Sharon confirmed that the note would be read publicly when the time was right. An echo from a man who once screamed into the void and now leaves behind a promise. In his final act of devotion, he requested that all royalties from his solo music continue to fund these causes indefinitely. Music saved me, maybe it'll save someone else, he said. 10 words that summed up an entire life. Since his second induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2024, this time for his solo career, Ozzy's image had transcended culture. It had become something spiritual. His face painted on murals, his riffs pulsing through subway headphones, his lyrics quoted in classrooms and tattooed on the skin of lifelong fans. But the truest tribute wasn't found in platinum records. It was in the people who chose to fight, because he had fought too. Ozzy Osbourne, the madman who once bit bats and mocked death, now rests in peace. He didn't resist the dimming of the light. He faced it and walked toward it, not with fear, but with a heart full of memories and defiance. If these words stirred something in you, if any part of your youth, your pain, or your own way of enduring is tied to the sound of his voice, leave a comment, share a memory, or simply write, "Thank you." Because Ozzy's legacy is not a tale of chaos. It is proof that even the most shattered souls can leave the world burning brighter than they found it. Rest now, Ozzy, let the noise finally fade, and may the silence by bring you peace. Thank you for watching this tribute to one of rock's most unforgettable legends. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving it a like. It helps us keep these stories alive, the ones that matter most. And above all, never forget the echo Ozzy left behind. That real survival is not about strength